Hello. Welcome to the Tortoise Global Education Summit. I'm Chris Cook. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise. If you're just joining us now, I'll reprise what it is we're doing. This is what we call a think-in, which is effectively an attempt to outsource a large part of our work. One of the problems that journalistic organisations have is that they're full of people who have a certain set of experiences and very strong views and a lot of knowledge about some aspects of the world, like, as I keep saying, page layout and font choices, but they're not so good on a lot of other things. And what we need to do is basically, we believe that by bringing other people in to our conversations about what we should be doing, we can improve both the output of our journalism, but also our topic choice as well. First of all, I should thank the Nuffield Foundation, who are supporting this particular think-in. I should say that if you're new to Zoom, you've already been muted, but you can have your say by clicking the raise your hand button. A key point of this being a sort of a meeting is that it's not supposed to be like question time. It's supposed to be a forum for us to talk among ourselves. So quite unusually, we prefer comments to questions. You can, if you're feeling less brave, type your comments in the chat. My colleague Zav Greenwood is going to be creating the chats during this think-in, and he might be asking you, if you say something interesting, if we can promote you to glory and get you onto camera. We're going to be recording this discussion so that we can edit up the best bits and share them with people who aren't here in person. The topic is how do we break the link between inequality and educational outcomes? And one of the dispiriting things about education is the extent that everywhere you go in the world, and even if you go into the greatest schools in the world, it's a almost universal rule that the poorer children will tend to do worse than richer children when we look at any set of attainment figures. The challenge of how you have a sort of open society and capitalist open society with an education system that allows for fairness is a really significant challenge. And part of what we're going through at the moment in the world is really a response to that fact that, it isn't an even playing field. We've got three particular guests who I'd like to introduce you to. We've got Josh Hillman, who is the Education Director at the Nuffield Foundation. Josh leads the Foundation's work in education. It's a big funder of education research. We've got Cami Anderson, who is, among other things, the superintendent of schools in Newark in New Jersey. Superintendents of schools for British viewers are what the character Superintendent Skinner does. It's like a Director of Children's Services in the English context. We've also got V Kativu. V is a young person, you'll see, who's just graduated from Oxford, and she uses her extraordinary social media presence to promote basically aspiration, to encourage people to apply for things they might not otherwise go for. I was hoping I could start by asking Josh, basically, to talk us through, over a few minutes, over sort of what, if you like, the state of the art is. What do we know about poverty, inequality, and educational outcomes?
Thanks, Chris. Well, we know that socioeconomic and family background, however you measure it, about wealth, parental occupation, educational levels, they're all highly correlated with each other. We know that continues to be the most powerful predictor of educational outcomes, and that it's stronger in the UK than in most other countries, that relationship. And the intergenerational influences appear as soon as we're able to measure them, and that they no doubt operate before, from birth, probably even actually conception, and that they operate continuously through the life and at particular critical transition points into primary school, into secondary school, and then where pathway choices are made, such as subject choices. And so because of that, we've got this extremely large achievement gap in this country, as in many other countries, between advantaged and disadvantaged kids at all levels of the system. Now, clearly there's a major role for educational policy and educational institutions in breaking that link. And before just suggesting some priorities in that area, I just wanted to make a plea for us being realistic and therefore modest about the expectations we can have about the role of education. And I say that for three related reasons, which are all rather daunting, which are effectively making it more difficult for the education system to work against the flow. The first is really reinforced by the great discussion we had this morning on the future of employment. And the most powerful driver of social mobility is change in occupational structure, on which education only has a small effect compared to economic and other forces. Secondly, in terms of wider learning and development for children, schools are part of a really complex web in children's lives, along with attributes of their domestic space, their community, other public services experienced by their families. So many schools, in addition to doing their day jobs, are compensating for shortfalls in these, alleviating their effects, whether that's about physical and mental health of the family, stress, financial difficulties, alcohol and drugs, incarceration, and perhaps most importantly, those factors structure what the jargon calls the home learning environment, which capture parenting styles and resources and activities that children do. Now, one of our projects showed that once you control for the intakes of schools, around 10% of the differences between those schools in their achievement can be attributed to differences in their effectiveness, much lower than you would commonly understand it to be, and so certainly a hell of a lot lower than the raw league tables that we look at. And what this gives us a flavour of is the dominant role of those other factors. And our research into what the impact of COVID-19 school closures has been on different types of families has shown stark variations in the home learning environment, in the engagement, the quantity of learning activity that pupils have been doing. And schools have extremely limited means of mitigating this. And then third, even the most radical education policies that are ranged against these powerful forces are marshaled by advantaged families who are very concerned about downward social mobility. And so their private investment in the face of the positional role of education and unemployment uncertainties that were described this morning is likely to increase. So those are the sort of provisos. And I just wanted to say a few things about three areas: early years, schools, and post-compulsory. On the early years, policymakers have long talked about conflicting purposes of childcare. It's partly about improving labour market opportunities, particularly for women. It's partly about providing stronger educational foundations for what psychologists and brain scientists know to be formative and malleable years of child development. But it's this third purpose that we're interested in here, which is that by the age of 3, children from poorer backgrounds on average have as much as a year behind their advantaged peers. So potentially, if you invest in the early education, that might help them to catch up, or at least not fall further behind later. But there's two difficulties with that. First is that there's disproportionately lower participation of disadvantaged children in early years education, despite the evidence that they've got the most to gain from it. And secondly, there's big questions about the extent to which the highest quality of provision has been enabled and incentivized enough. So that's why we are focusing heavily on the workforce, early years workforce and their training, and also the development and evaluation of programs, particularly aimed at disadvantaged kids. Now in schools, if you want to tackle inequality, I would prioritize 3 areas: admissions, funding, and teaching quality. And on admissions, we've just got to find ways of making it easier for disadvantaged pupils to go to the higher performing schools, which are disproportionately used by advantaged families for a whole complex range of reasons, but it's to do with the admission system and the dominance of the proximity factor between home and school, and the relationship between that and residential patterns and costs of housing, and also the different choice strategies that are adopted by different types of family. We published some research on this last week. And then on funding, I think there's a strong argument, particularly in the light of COVID-19, to boost pupil premium. But I would also like to see more direct central funding for interventions that are targeting disadvantaged pupils. So get straight to the pupils rather than diverting funding through schools. And then on teaching quality, we know it's a critical issue. We also know that disadvantaged students are less likely to be taught by teachers who are qualified in their subject, less experienced, more likely to be subject to turnover, and that obviously compounds the disadvantage, gets worse when teacher recruitment and retention is under pressure as it is at the moment. So I would argue for much stronger financial incentives to attract more experienced and qualified teachers to schools that are serving those disadvantaged kids. And then on post-compulsory, most of the attention goes on widening participation in higher education. We'll probably talk about that later. Our research shows that even once you account for prior achievement, those from disadvantaged backgrounds are on degree routes with lower labour market rewards, and that's partly because a higher proportion of those students are effectively under matching, that's attending courses with less selective intakes than their A-level attainment would enable. And if you look at the potential reasons for that, things like over-pessimistic teacher predictions, poorer provision of information, advice and guidance by their schools, fewer opportunities to visit universities, then those are all factors that are going to be made worse, I think, by the current crisis, particularly for the current year 13 cohort, but also the year below them as well. And then there's just finally, you know, there's a danger that all this focus on the higher ends of achievement and income just crowds out attention across the wider spectrum. I was really pleased to hear a lot of talk this morning about further education and vocational education, because the big bifurcation that takes place by socioeconomic background is between those following higher education routes and those taking FE and other vocational forms of provision, where the evidence base, of course, is also much weaker, which is why we are now focusing on that sort of other half of the cohort. And then again, just to end, very pleased to hear finally some discussion about people over the age of 21. You know, most of the educational inequality debate gets focused on children and then on sort of 16 to 21-year-olds, but it's wrong to think that it's all over by then for social mobility and that second chances can't contribute to educational equality or even economic equality. So there's a strong role for lifelong learning, and I would like to see that coming back centre stage.
Okay, great, thank you. Cami, can I come to you? I guess I hope you don't mind me comparing you to Superintendent Skinner, first of all, but I was hoping you could talk to us about your experience. So you had the task of taking over, I mean, the word notorious is unfair, but a school system that was famous for having serious challenges in New Jersey. And how do you respond to, first of all, to Josh's sort of, I think conservatism rather than pessimism, really,
First of all, thanks for having me. I've been an educator for 30 years. I was a teacher, a school leader, the executive director of Teach for America, and then the chief program officer at an organization that trains school principals. Then I was the superintendent of alternative high schools and programs in New York City, where I ran a large portfolio of services for adults, young adults and adults. So to Josh's point, then I was the superintendent in Newark, and now I run an organization that works with systems all over the country. So just to give you a little bit of from whence I speak. And I'm thrilled to be on here with these distinguished other panelists. So I got so into listening, I forgot I had to talk. Anyway, I think, I would respectfully maybe disagree a little bit with Josh on the conservative role that he says, or he suggested schools play. I mean, I've certainly seen some of the research that he refers to, but I have just experienced firsthand the catalytic impact an excellent teacher, an excellent school, and an excellent system can have on the trajectory of a young person. I sort of start with the premise that every single young person has exceptional talents, and it is our job as adults and educators to create the conditions for them to thrive. And when we have an entire generation of students living in poverty, and also predominantly Black students, even controlling for socioeconomic status that are not performing at the same level of their peers, I start with the assumption that we are failing them, not that there's something inherently inevitable about that outcome. And so, I have seen schools in the exact same neighborhood get radically different results. I've seen teachers on the exact same floor get radically different results. And so, you know, for me, there's a reason I have voted with my feet. There's a reason I work in education. I do believe that if we get the ingredients right, it should allow every young person to excel and to graduate with the social, emotional, and academic skills to make every life choice they deserve, right? And I believe they deserve to choose to go to college. You know, my position, and this was when I was superintendent, was I did not believe in vocational tracks, not that I didn't believe in high quality work embedded learning, but I didn't believe in vocational tracks because I believe that has been used, at least in the United States, as a not so thinly veiled tracking mechanism to undervalue the academic aptitude of young people.
I should say for British people, tracking is selection. So it's selection, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you're gonna have to help me, Chris. It's been a minute since I've done press in your neck of the woods. So that's all to say, you know, here's some things that I do agree with Josh on. His three, you know, sort of pieces of investment. I'll sort of add a couple. One, there's tons of evidence that investments in high quality early education pays off in dividends. And we actually know a lot about how to make sure that low income families have access to that. That was one of the main priorities we had in Newark, was to make sure that we had universal pre-K and to ensure that that universal pre-K was high quality, both in terms of helping little people get used to being in a, you know, sort of social environment, and also to expose them to words and early reading, and to be in active partnership with their families. I have never met a parent who didn't want the best for their kid. And it is unconscionable to me that schools think of themselves as being separate from families and communities. The best schools that I have seen, especially early childhood ones, are in deep partnership with families and are skillful in creating a very integrated approach to how their little people and then eventually their big people are growing up. The piece about funding, I couldn't be more on board with that. Money matters. And there's two things I want to point out there. One, we have in the US, we have something called weighted student funding that assigns more resources to young people who have the greatest need for support. So students with disabilities, students who are living below the poverty level, that works. I mean, it's we need to make, you know, much more targeted, intelligent investments, but we also need for the folks who are running systems like me to have the flexibility to invest it where it will have the biggest impact, and that often isn't the case. There's lots of constraints. We can get into that, but it's not just about the amount, right? It's about like how you can invest it.
Okay. And can I ask about expectations? Sorry, go on.
Yeah,
as well.
Go ahead. No. One more thing, just on the talent side, because that, to me, that's almost everything. If you actually asked me, if you only gave me one bet, I would bet on recruiting, selecting, training, and retaining the highest quality school leaders. You know, the folks who run the building. There are so many studies to show that the impact of that person, their skill set, is massive, and that's commensurate with my experience. And then of course, that person's ability to recruit, select, and retain the highest quality teachers, guidance counselors, support staff. So I think we undervalue the sort of building leadership and their impact on student outcomes. So I just wanted to sort of return to the three. I'm with the three, and I'm also very much. We can talk more about vocational ed. I have a lot of concerns about it, but I think it has a lot of promise. But I'm also very much. We have lots of evidence that there's no reason to believe that if you somehow don't graduate from high school, that there aren't a bunch of ways for you to get a lot of on-ramps for you to access an economy by engaging in adult learning. And so I very much agree with that.
I mean, one of the things that I think we'll come back to two-year college in a bit, not now, but in a bit, because I think that we have a sort of half concept of it in Britain. but like there's a gap that's sort of missing about progression. That. Can I ask you about expectation? Because there are two things I think interesting about Newark. The first is, anything's interesting about Newark, but the two that jump to mind are, first, there's like there's a school reform like news story that goes, tough new superintendent or leader comes in, they make school very unfun, and then they just talk about expectations a lot. And I think, to be fair, you've seen that, right? You've had that experience. And one of the things I think is really hard to get across is how raising expectations and behavior go together, and whether a school with high expectations and a very strict behavior policy is a draconian and dark place, which I think these are things that sort of muddled in people's heads. Could you just talk about that for a moment?
Of course. Well, gosh, first of all, if you talk to students and families, students want rigorous, hard, meaningful work. And there's nothing, and when that's done well, when you go into a great teacher's classroom and young people are just busy doing super hard, interesting work where they see their own experiences reflected, that's exciting. There's nothing, sort of boring or draconian about it. And in fact, young people, when you poll young people and families, they want that. And too often for poor kids and kids of color, they receive less rigorous assignments. They receive fewer assignments that actually reflect their experiences, and just in terms of sheer representation. They're asked to consume history that is whitewashed and does not reflect the realities. So great schools do the opposite of that, right? Like high academic expectations are both desired by everyone, and when done properly, couldn't be more exciting. Like, you walk into the classroom, and even as an adult, you're like, forget you're supposed to be observing the teacher because you're so like sucked into the content. And as far as the behavior, look, I just want to be super clear. The organization I run now is actively, explicitly tearing down sort of militaristic, police-like tactics in discipline, because it doesn't work. The way that the highest performing schools approach young people is by letting them lead, by creating clear expectations and norms that they actually own, by building trusting relationships, by knowing how to de-escalate, by assuming that behavior is communication, not something to be controlled. So in fact, what I believe and what we did in Newark to raise expectation is the opposite of what you just said. We invested in high quality content, and yeah, we made things harder, but in a very rigorous, engaging way. And we actually actively like dismantled, frankly, the practices around discipline and behavior that were top down and punitive, because we felt, A, they're biased, right? We police Black students in ways we don't police white students, and B, that they don't work. Kids are not going to be motivated to learn rigorous material if they feel, that they are not sort of equal partners in the learning. So to me, high expectations are exactly the opposite of what you laid out. And that's how we, still work to be done. But over the 5 years I was in Newark, we actively pursued academic expectations that were engaging and difficult, but fun. And we also explicitly pursued policies around discipline that were not about controlling and over-policing, but were about empowering and partnering with young people.
Okay, great. So V, I don't know if I could come to you for your reflections on that. Your background is you just graduated from Oxford. You use your astonishing social media bandwidth to sort of promote basically higher aspiration. Could I ask, where did you go to school in England? Or not in England, in Wales, in fact, I think, wasn't it?
That's true. So I was born in Zimbabwe, and then I moved to England, went to a school in the West Midlands, and then I went to Wales, went to a school called Hawthorne High School, and then I came back to England and I went to a school called Dudley Sixth Form, and then I went to Oxford. So it was a bit of an up, down, up, down, up, down. But yeah, they weren't the schools that were like full of high aspirations, as Cami was just talking about. I think it's true. It's really, really important to have a place that pushes you beyond your limits, beyond what you think you're capable of, because it makes you want to work harder. And I think it's super, super dangerous when you're in a school where everyone just wants you to just get by, just to scrape the grades that you just needed. You're never pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And it kind of, yeah, I think aspirations definitely have to be raised and things.
So I mean, the West Midlands are like a difficult place for education in England. Like it's, 100%. They are not. It's not London, right? It's not East London. And what was your experience of the sort of the school's approach to you applying for Oxford?
So my experience with schooling in general before Oxford was just, like I said, you kind of were part of a number and they just wanted you to just get by. And when I was in my sixth form and I said, hey, I'm thinking about going to Oxford. And at that time they still did A-levels where you get your first year grades and then your second year grades. So my first year grades were great. Like I was like, I qualify for this. And when I was looking up what universities to go to, because I was so naive in the sense that I just believed the world was like fairies and rainbows, and if you want to go to the best school in the world, then you just go to the best school in the world. If you have the grades, why not? So I googled where's the best place to study history, and I found out it was Oxford. So I just marched into school and I said, hey, I want to go to Oxford and I want to start the process. And to me, it was just how do we get going? And there was no question about it. And it was my teacher's response that made me realize, oh, the world's a little different to what I think. And she said, like, there's not enough time. It's going to take a lot of work. Like, it's really, really hard. And it's just not for people like us. And we're going to have to take all the classes we're doing for personal statements and change them just for you to cater to Oxford and Cambridge because they have different personal statements. You have to do an admissions test. We're going to have to get ready for that. And it's going to take extra work that we just can't do. Like, we'd rather do for everyone than just for a few. So unfortunately, it's a no. And she said no. So I couldn't, and you need your teacher's support for you to be able to apply to a place like Oxford because of references and things. And when she said no, it was no, and I didn't apply. And it was the worst feeling because at home, I come from a Zimbabwean background. My mom had migrated to the UK, so she didn't really understand the UK education system. And that was the same for uncles and aunties. So school was the place where if she says no, it's a no. There's no going home and your mom's like, hey, I went to Oxford, I'll help you. If she says no, it's a no. So yeah, I didn't apply the first time around and it ate at me for so long. I was like, I have the grades, I have the desire, but why is she saying no? Like, we can do this. And we didn't do it. And then in the second year, I decided like, no, that was a mistake. I've got to try this. And I received an email about a foundation year that was being piloted at Oxford. It was the first of its kind in both Oxford and Cambridge. And it was targeted at students like myself from disadvantaged backgrounds who just, because of external circumstances like schooling, teaching, things like that, they wouldn't get to Oxbridge easily. Or I could have gotten there, but it would have taken a lot of work in a longer time. So that foundation year was introduced in 2016. And when I saw that email, I was like, I've got to do this because I know I'm not going to get the support of my school. So this is the way. And I applied, I got in, I was one of the first 10 in both Oxford and Cambridge to do it. And then I reapplied after being there for a year. And then I got in for the full program at Oxford. And then I've just not graduated yet because of the pandemic, but I've just finished my exams about 2 weeks ago. And here we are.
Well, do you think the foundation year is basically, if you like, a
bridging course in a sense,
a stepping stone, so you can go into and so so it basically means they think that you've got the ability to do the course, and not have the content, basically.
Yes.
Right, so helping you bridge from basically a bad school into
yes. So what I quickly realized when I arrived at Oxford is that education was not the same for everybody. And once again, I guess if you stay in one place and you never leave, you believe the world is just like that. But until you come out of there, you're like, oh wow, there is more than just what I've experienced. And when I was at school, I was like, oh, everyone goes to a school where the class is like 26 people full or 27, and everyone has people fighting in school, and someone's like pregnant or getting drunk or whatever. Like, that's just the norm. And then when I got to Oxford and my friends were like, oh, we were so stressed last year, there was a class of 6, it was too many. I'm like, whoa, you can even have classes of 6? And they're like, yeah, like, it's just how I've been learning my whole life. And your teacher knows you fully by name. Whereas in my school, our reports were essentially copied and pasted, you know, because there was just too many of us. And when I realized like, oh, wow, like there is different types of schooling and I'm competing with you guys, how is that? It baffled me. I was like, how is that even fair on any sense? Because the paths we've walked and for us to compete for that same thing, you're miles ahead of me. Like I couldn't even catch up if I dreamed of it. Like I just don't even know how you would bridge that gap. So then I realized what that foundation year was for. At first I thought I understood, but when I was there I was like, oh, so this year is to get me up to scratch with what my friends have been having for the past 10 years. And from the age of like 13, they were told, Oxbridge, yeah, you can do that. Why not? Like, of course, listen, people who've been here, your alumni went to Oxbridge. Why not? Whereas when I went to my teacher, she was like, oh, that's Planet Mars. We can't do that. So when you have those two different sets of walks in life, I think, whoa, how are we competing? Blows my mind. To this day, it still blows my mind.
Can I come back to Cami briefly to talk about 2-year college, because the community college? Because
sure. Can I just quickly say though, like that story to me is so inspiring and also so tragic at the same time. Like you're incredible and you're an inspiration for all of the adults on this call. Like, thank you. But that shouldn't happen. I mean, this is my point. Like this is education malpractice. Like there should not be, our schools should be designed for all young people to get with that level of expertise and motivation to get the content that she deserved, the support she deserved. And she is an exceptional young person who's succeeding despite our broken system. And that's, that shouldn't be the case. So I just had to say that. Go ahead.
But I think the interesting things about V's story is the unusual in Britain thing of creating a structure that sits between school and university.
Yeah.
And the US has a more formalized, it's not quite the same thing, but
the community college. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like the equivalent of our FE colleges, you can expect to do a post-school course. And if you do well, it's a second chance to apply to at the end of a sort of the first is to apply to a conventional college. Does it work?
It can work very well. So community colleges here in the United States, essentially just to, quickly, they a lot of it, they are community based. Often they're less expensive. And to your point, Chris, they often individuals who have gone to schools that are not as higher performing or can't afford to go directly to a 4-year university can go to a 2-year college, get an AA or something, it's sort of a stepping stone degree, and then apply to 4-year colleges. And in places like California, for example, sometimes there's even automatic admission. So you can go to a California community college, and then if you maintain a certain GPA, then you have automatic admission to the University of California system to get your 4-year degree. And I'm a huge fan of community colleges. The good ones are incredible, and they play somewhat of a role that we heard here of bridging your K-12 experience with your 4-year degree. And there are some really awesome ones that have very great leaders and professors and instructors who are very passionate about helping young people prepare for 4-year universities. And just like everything, there's really low quality ones that because in our system these are not considered as prestigious. So it's the professors may be there because they didn't get a job at a 4-year university. So I mean, I've seen honestly some of the most exciting things I've seen have been in our 2-year community colleges, and also some of the lowest quality things. So it's sort of like everything, but it is, when it works, it can be a real opportunity for young people who went to low performing high schools and low performing K-12 systems to really engage in high quality adult learning, to close some of those skill gaps and to get ready to go on to a 4-year university. Some of them have exceptional retention rates and do very well in helping bridge that gap for kids who grow up in low performing systems. And some of them, the numbers are terrible. So it all comes down to leadership and quality. But it can be a great pathway, particularly if the systems that the young people are coming from have failed them.
Right. I mean, I think it's, for British people, I always feel like it's a thing we kind of don't ask our equivalent colleges to do. Can I come to Vignesh? Yeah, have I pronounced your name correctly, Vignesh? You'll have to forgive me if I haven't. Sorry, I should have given my colleagues more notice to find him.
Unmuted.
Oh, there we are. Here you are. We can hear you.
Hiya. That's great. Hi. I'm Vignesh. I'm in year 13. I go to a local state school here in West London. And I first off want to start off by saying, hi V, I'm a big fan. I watched a lot of your videos when I applied to Oxford. And I also want to say thank you to Cami for bringing up quite a few points that I want to talk about first. First is integrating families. She talked about how a lot of the schools that she worked in kind of ostracized families from being part of the community that was a school. And the schools that I've gone to do that a lot. I see them as trying to integrate themselves into family life, etc. But often it's a place of refuge where people can go to get away from their family life, and I think that needs to be respected as well, because a lot of people's their families aren't exactly the best families to grow up in. A lot of my friends are like that. Thankfully, I'm not, but they see school as a place to come and hang out rather than learn. And I think that equally, I mean, just as well as promoting education, it needs to be a place where people can come and be safe, essentially. The other thing that she talked about was flexibility in how they recruit people, teachers to stay and teach at these schools. And we, at our school, we call it the turnover rate. How long does teachers stay in their post before deciding, no, actually, I want to go to a school where the students aren't as badly behaved or aren't as hard to teach, etc. And in a school like mine, where the focus is mainly to get people that 4 in the English and maths, the turnover rate is incredible. My school has a high proportion of free school meals, which is one of the indicators that people use to measure to get an idea of how disadvantaged the school is. And I think that the data that I've looked at shows that the schools that have a higher proportion of free school meal students have a higher turnover rate. And we need to do something to make sure that the teachers who go into these schools know what they're getting into and stay and look after the kids, that form a relationship with them, because when they're gone in a year, it's then that you start to see students become disengaged with the subject, which is quite disheartening. And what Cami said about trusting students and behavior being about communication, that's really important as well, I think. So when V talks about getting by and getting just the bare minimum, that was like incredibly, like that. I've seen that every day at school. The language that they use at school is, oh, we want you to pass your GCSEs, not get the best grades that you can, just pass your GCSEs. And I hope I don't sound arrogant when I say that my results were very anomalous to the school's average. I got 8 9s, an A and an A star, and the school's average was something like a few 4s and maybe a few passes in science. So first of all, that shouldn't be the case in any school. In any school, you should have, the majority of people passing and a good proportion of those majorities getting the good grades, right? You should have teaching and learning in such a way that that's what you achieve. That's not the case in my school and in many schools in my area. And when V talked about her optimism, I was part of this program by a charity called the Brilliant Club, which encourages social mobility from disadvantaged students. They hook you, I don't know if hook you up is a correct term for it. They connect you with PhD students and help you like understand different topics. So I did one on pandemics, which is quite pertinent. We did it on Ebola, so that was one. And we did it on things like astrophysics, and we went to places like Oxford, and we went to places like King's College London, and we went to places like Royal Holloway. We went to universities outside our area, and we saw them, and we said, actually, I can go here. And that's what made me want to go to Oxford. But when I went to my head of sixth form, said, sorry, do you have a question? Sorry.
The time is ticking on a little.
I'm so sorry.
It's all right. No. Just finish up.
When I went to my sixth form, head of sixth form, and I said, I want to apply to Oxford, she said, I'm not sure we have the resources for that. Do you want to reconsider? And she said that to me 2 or 3 times. But it was because of people like V and people and other YouTubers who you know, promote people like me to go and look at other options rather than relying on our schools, so that we can get to where we get.
Thank you ever so much. It's horrifying to think that, in London, which is the best part of the British school, all the British school systems, that there are still schools behaving like that, Vignesh. That's really terrible. And strangely, a very neat segue to Sir Tim Brighouse, who was in fact what we would now call the Director of Children's Services for the largest school system in the world, in the Birmingham schools, and you ran the London Challenge, which sort of has been credited with driving reform in London. What are your reflections on all this, Tim?
Well, my reflections are that Vignesh is describing how somebody with very strong resilience and who's become an autodidact almost, is able to negotiate even the most choppy of waters and have experiences and be determined to succeed, just as the first one of your witnesses described the same path. I suppose at the moment I'm living on the edge of Oxford and have been involved in providing resources through a thing called the Hamilton Trust to ensure that people living in OX4, which is the wrong side of the tracks in Oxford, it's on Blackbird Leys, close to the car works, etc. Providing resources to schools in those areas and opportunities in those areas to try and ensure that youngsters who never get out of the local community actually see what's available to them in another part of Oxford, which is OX1. So there's a great debate about how do you help OX4 access the Commonwealth, which is huge, but is all in OX1. And it made me think that one of the things I deeply regret in my career, lots of things I regret. For instance, I regret that in the 10 years I ran Oxfordshire, I used to, you know how heads have a mantra, or my mantra was celebrating success. I deeply regretted it later, and much preferred my mantra in Birmingham, which was improving on previous bests. And it's pretty obvious why I feel that the second was better than the first, because the good teacher is always enabling young people to improve on their previous best. But there are lots of things I regret that I didn't do that are pertinent to this. One of them would be, well, come on, the Russell Group of universities all have very disadvantaged areas very close to where they are. Why don't we expect them to adopt schools in those areas, make sure the heads of department are visiting faculty in the university's department, which would all aid recruitment? Why on earth don't they devote some resource which could be funded through the Office of Students, that if they don't do it, then they're going to get some sort of a penalty, to youngsters in the equivalent of my OX4 illustration to have experiences in the university. And why don't they? I mean, you know, they can select for as much as they like. Why don't we turn to those schools and say, yeah, each year we'll give 10% of your entry opportunities within our universities. Now that would take care of the Russell Group, and it could extend to every university. And equally, why don't we make those universities have places on the governing bodies of those schools? Why don't we have visiting research fellows from the university on the governing body? There are loads of things that, with the benefit of hindsight, I wish I'd given priority to, and those are some that would affect this particular issue. That's all I want to say.
Thanks ever so much, Tim. Could we come to Daniel Dipper, who has had his hand up for a long time? So my apologies, Daniel. We're going to slightly overrun. I can warn you now. Daniel.
Hello, can you hear me, see me? Yep. Hello. So yeah, yeah, I was going to kind of second a bit of what Vignesh said. I mean, I've applied to Oxford. I'm an Oxford offer holder as well, and I have to say that there was definitely a little bit of resistance there in terms of actually applying. And I just put in the chat as well, Joe said in Zero Gravity have really helped me to get to Oxford, and he was an Oxford graduate, and he's done a lot of work trying to get basically disadvantaged state school pupils there. There's a lot of stuff as well from Josh that I really want to second, like for example the fact that basically since schools have closed I've had next to zero support whatsoever, and it's been the same for a lot of students. I've actually off my own back volunteered to help a lot of year 12 students with their personal statements, including potential Oxbridge applicants, and I've been running sessions for them because basically the provision hasn't been there, and if I wasn't doing it then literally they would be left in the dark, which is just really bad. It's a situation that shouldn't be the case at all. And also I've shared in the library on the Education Summit an article that I wrote about actually my serious concerns about the grading system, which I think gets right to the heart of this issue that we are talking about right now, because we've got our emergency grading system in place, but I actually feel that there's a strong risk that this is going to discriminate against these very students that should be going to Oxbridge, the ones that we need to be encouraging to go there, because it uses your past school performance, which is to me just ludicrous. It should be the work of us, actually the students themselves, what they've achieved. Just because you go to a school that isn't very good doesn't mean that's all you can achieve. So yeah, it's definitely about raising ambition. And I mean, I've submitted evidence to the House of Commons Education Committee, I've written the blog, and I'm just trying to raise the profile on that issue as well to hopefully make sure that these students are not the ones who are disadvantaged as a result of it.
Where do you live, Daniel?
Peterborough.
Peterborough. Okay. I mean, that's not a town with a great school system, bluntly.
No, well, I've actually chosen to go to a school in Fenland, which is just down the road, which is even worse funded. It's actually got some of the worst student funding in the country, to the point a few years ago, the government actually gave them extra top-up money because they admitted that they basically messed it up with the formulae.
Right. And thank you ever so much, Dan. That's really helpful. Can we go to Tony P, who again, I apologise for the long waits on coming to people. Tony P. I feel like a local radio DJ doing this. Tony. No. Oh, there we go. Tony. Hello. Maybe we waited too long. Maybe. Okay, all right, so let's go. Can we go to, sorry, this is a real challenge for my colleagues. Can we go to J.A. Neto?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, hello.
Okay. Well, I guess I want to throw a spanner in the works.
By the way.
There's been great information put out by everybody in this session. I've lived 22 years in the UK, mostly in England, but 5 years now in Wales. And I was in Canada the rest of the time. But anyway, my kids are educated in England and some at university in Canada. But I believe that the ruling class simply wants the education system to stay just like it is. And this is, if anything, the biggest obstacle that we face to reduce inequalities. The ruling class requires a significant number of poorly educated people to be in the population. They control the press enough to put things in there. We all know which kind of press organs we're talking about. That poorly educated people, sadly, are more likely to take on board. And there is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you build a system that has inequalities of access and inequalities of opportunity, you are going to get a huge attainment gap, and you can just keep everything rolling.
that's an amazingly bleak and
I can propose a solution to it as well. Like it's very complicated, but I can propose something. I have something. I'm informed by ways of teaching and curricula for maths particularly, which I would encourage people to look at Math Minds, which Anne Watson, who's an emeritus professor at Oxford, endorses, and Jump Math, based at the Fields Institute at the University of Toronto, as a curriculum. And there are a couple of 100,000 children in the world in 5 different countries that are using, and the teachers trained to deliver the maths curriculum. Maths is a big, determinant of confidence and success in other aspects of life. But there are massive obstacles in the UK. I come from a relatively classless country that was peasant farmers a generation before me. And, we all muck in together, and nobody has like the social prejudices in the UK are, wow, they're so embedded. Anyway, that's all I want to say. I'm optimistic, actually.
You have a different definition of optimism to me, I have to say, Tony. Thank you ever so much. I think we have already overrun, and I should wrap up. And I first want to thank everyone who's contributed. There's a lot there. Josh started off with his 3 appeals for admissions, which we didn't really talk about. But funding and teacher quality are 2 things that came through, not just from V and Daniel and Vignesh, about the importance not just of having teachers who can do it, but teachers who believe that you can do it too, notwithstanding Tony's skepticism. I have to confess to being sort of mortified slightly that there are still teachers who speak to people like they've spoken to you, Vignesh, Daniel, and V. I was an education reporter 10 years ago, and one of the things we were sort of diligently telling people was, well, the good news is at least no one is telling children they can't do things anymore. Like, at least we've moved on from that. And it's really troubling that those attitudes are still so prevalent. Cami, I thought your optimism was a nice contrast to Tony's pessimism, but I think one of the things that's the idea that you can kind of, there are a lot of win-win-win things here that we can take away from your experience, that you can fix, you don't have to have what some people refer to as carceral, discipline in schools. You can have nice, energetic schools that work and that deliver results, and that there isn't a trade-off there that we have to worry about. I think it's good to see Tim Brickhouse, the patron saint of English teachers, speaking about sorry, that's my washing machine. His experience and reflecting on what it is that one of the things we learned today was that Vignesh and V and Daniel are all people who I think we're going to end up working for quite soon. Self-starters who can't be put down. So I think if nothing else, we've learned who is going to take over this country in short order. So can I thank you all for participating? The comments are remarkably thoughtful and insightful. And if you've got a moment between the 7 minutes between now and the next session, I urge you to sort of have a scroll through. Thank you to the Nuffield Foundation for funding us on this and helping us to put this together. We're going to be doing at 3 o'clock, what would a revolutionized education system look like? It's on the same Zoom link. If you're a Tortoise member, you can continue these discussions and network with other attendees in the app. If you're not a member, do join us. You can join for 30 days for free. And Xavier will be sharing the free trial link in the chat now. Possibly not now, but imminently. Thanks ever so much for your time, and I'll see you soon.